All right, welcome to Lesson 29, which is all about graphs. And if you would like to turn to Lesson 29 in your book, which is page 97, if you're using the third edition, you can actually see some of these graphs, which will be useful since this is a very visual lesson. So we're going to learn about 3 different types of illustrations that will help represent different types of data. And that would be the bar graph and the broken line graph and the pie chart, or they're calling it the pie graph here. So let's start with the bar graph. Go ahead and look at the new car sales graph, bar graph, on page 97 or on lesson 29. And let's look at a few features. So first of all, we know what this bar graph is representing because we have a title there. It's called New Car Sales. So this bar graph will illustrate how many new cars were sold in the different months. You'll see that on the bottom there we have different months: January, February, March, April, and May. So those will tell us which month we are looking at. And then on the vertical axis we have how many cars, the number of cars that were sold. So we have 0, 100, 200, 300, and 400. If you look at the shaded portion under January, you'll see that that shaded line goes up to that first horizontal line. Now we don't have a number next to that line, but since it is halfway to 100, we could probably assume that in January, 50 cars were sold since that's halfway to 100. Now let's look at February. Now that bar goes all the way up to the third line, which is halfway between 100 and 200. So how many cars do you think were sold in February? Well, if you said 150, that was correct. Now how about March? March is up to that 100 line, so 100 cars were sold in March. April is halfway between 300 and 400, so probably 350 cars. And May is at the 100 car line. So instead of just having a paragraph written saying in January 50 cars were sold, in February 150 cars were sold, they decided here to make an illustration where we have it organized by the month and the number of cars. And this makes it really easy to see at a glance which month was most successful at selling cars. That would be April, obviously, since it has the biggest bar. And then which month was the worst? That would be January with only 50 cars. So sometimes it can be very useful to illustrate the data we're working with instead of just writing it out. And I'm actually making several bar graphs and other graphs like this for a report I'm making for a nonprofit. Instead of just having a bunch of tables with information on it, I decided to make a graph, and this allowed people at the annual meeting to very easily see how much money we were taking in and then where we got that money from, and it was just very easy to read because it was illustrated. And in general, people like pictures, people like illustrations. So that's a bar graph. Now if you look to the right at the broken line graph, you'll see that it's very similar, although instead of having bars, it simply has a dot. So January, you'll see, has a dot at the 50 car line. February has a dot at the 150 car line, and etc. So, and then they connected the points with a single line versus having the actual bar. So that's another way of representing data. And then the good thing about that is you can kind of see more easily the trend. So you'll see from January to February, there were more cars sold, then less cars sold in March, and then way up to a lot of cars sold in April, and then back down in May. So it kind of helps you see the direction of those car sales. Just 2 other tips to keep in mind when you are designing your own graph. Don't forget the title, first of all, and then make sure that the divisions you choose on the vertical axis make sense. So let's say we're selling flowers on Monday, on Tuesday, and on Wednesday. So it wouldn't make sense to skip Thursday. So we should have a line for Thursday and then Friday. So just make sure it makes sense. Don't skip days, don't skip years. Make sure that it's equally spaced. And then that same goes for the vertical axis too. Let's say we sold 5 flowers, 10 flowers. So it wouldn't make sense to all of a sudden have 13 flowers, right? We need to keep up the pattern. So if we're doing 5, 10, 15, 20 flowers, make sure it makes sense. And in general, these numbers should either be divisible by 5 or by 2. So either make them even numbers, maybe big numbers like 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. Or if you're going to do smaller numbers, maybe even like 2, 4, 6, 8. But don't do something crazy like 7, 11, 17, 29. Like those numbers just don't make sense. Make sure that they are evenly spaced for one, and then that you keep up the pattern, and that they're divisible by at least 2 or by 5 or some sort of thing that makes sense. If you have a crazy pattern like 7, 11, 17, 29, it will just be more confusing than anything. So those are the only two titles. So I actually broke one of them. I need to write flowers sold. Don't forget your title. Otherwise, we won't know what we're talking about. All right, so the last type of graph we need to learn about is a pie graph. And this can be helpful. Let's say you are measuring, so don't forget a title, the amount of sunshine in the winter. So there's my title. And let's say every day you looked outside and you wrote down if it was sunny or cloudy. And here in Washington State, it's probably cloudy most of the time. So let's say 70% cloudy. Well, this isn't quite accurate, right? That's not quite 70%. Let's say 60%. That probably looks more like 60%. Ah! Sorry, that's not looking good. 60%. And then 40% of the time, it was sunny. So instead of just writing in the winter, 60% of the time it was cloudy, 40% of the time it was sunny, we made an illustration so you could see that 60% of the time it was cloudy, 40% was sunny. And hopefully you understand how I'm choosing to draw those lines. If it was 50%, then you would take half of the, whoops, that's crooked. You would take half of the pie, right? Because each would represent 50%. If it was, say, 25% of the time, you would do a fourth of the pie. If it was a third of the time, then you would make a third. So that's how you would draw things on a pie chart. And that's how you would read a pie chart as well. Important things to remember when making a pie chart is, of course, your title. And then just make sure that everything is clearly labeled with a percentage and then what you are measuring. All right, well, this is it for Lesson 29, and I hope this is useful for you when you are making your own graphs or reading graphs in other reports and documents that you see.